This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.
Welcome to the October 2025 episode of RCV Clips, our podcast about all things ranked choice voting. I'm Chris Hughes, a member of the Resource Center staff. In today's episode, I'll be talking with Grace Ramsey, co-director of Democracy Rising, about her work educating voters across the country about election reform. Thanks for joining us, Grace.
Thanks so much for having me.
Can you just start by telling me and our listeners a bit about yourself, how you got started working on election reform, and how you wound up as co-director of Democracy Rising?
Absolutely. Well, you may be able to hear through my accent at certain points during this podcast that I am from the Midwest. More specifically, I was born and raised in Wisconsin, and then went to college in Minnesota, specifically the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis, where they have ranked choice voting. So when I was my first year out of college, I got a job working on a voter education campaign with Fair Vote Minnesota. And so that was a really formative experience. I think we'd all gone through the 2010 midterm elections, which were pretty brutal. And I'd become really disillusioned with politics because we'd seen this really sharp turn towards ad hominem attacks being so commonplace and really politics just getting nastier and nastier. And I'd always thought, I was going to be one character from the West Wing. And I'd really given up on that dream because working for candidates, I think, breaks your heart in a really unique way. And so when I came across this opportunity to potentially work on behalf of just educating voters, of really investing in process and the people in the process, not necessarily the people running in that process, it felt like a way that I could sort of take my dreams and ambitions of wanting to exist within politics, but really working to make sure that politics worked for people. So I ended up helping manage the field team on that campaign. It was also a really unique experience where Fair Vote Minnesota ran basically a citywide campaign as though you were running for elected office, but the goal wasn't to win a seat on city council or something like that. The goal was to make sure voters were educated about the system. So I got to really engage deeply in community. I got to work with organizers from all over the city who were engaging, different constituencies that they were familiar with. And it really just taught me a lot about how these dynamics, there's a lot of promises we make when we talk about electoral reform. And it really takes a guiding hand to really let voters feel that. And so I left that experience incredibly motivated and sort of reinvigorated in the idea that these processes can work, but we have to, one, look at the systems and assess them. I think we take for granted sometimes the way our democracy functions, and we think it's just a given. So one, that you can change these things, and two, that when you change these things, your work is not done just by making the change, that we need to follow through and bring people along, because just like I was disillusioned, so many people are disillusioned. And so my goal ever since has been to give voters that spark of hope and inspiration that their democracy can work for them that I had when I first started learning about reforms like ranked choice voting.
That leads perfectly to my next question, because so much of the work that Democracy Rising does, that you do, is about socializing these reforms, making them more real for people and bringing them into people's lives. You've worked a ton on ranked choice voting, but I know you guys are working on other reform issues too. Generally, how are you approaching this task of socializing it? In Minnesota, in Minneapolis, you were essentially approaching this like a citywide campaign. Is that still the high-level approach? How are you doing it specifically to get into voters' day-to-day lives?
Day-to-day lives is a really good term to use, right? Because so much of what we do is we take this theory, right? A lot of the folks who work on electoral reform are brilliant, but they really exist in the theoretical space. And what we often try to do is bring that down to lived experiences of people's lives. And so while someone may not be an expert in how ranked choice voting works or what an open primary is, they're an expert in their own lives. And so really bringing that in, oftentimes before I even educate folks about a system or how their primary is going to be different, what ballots they're able to access versus those that they may not be. Oftentimes it's getting people to understand what their government actually does for them. and why it matters to participate, particularly on the local level, which is something I'm incredibly passionate about because I think it's where some of the most impactful politics takes place is in the city that you live in or the county that you live in. And so the focus really is meeting people where they are. So whether that's, at a farmer's market on a Saturday morning, whether that's at a bar on a Friday night, whether that's at kids' sports leagues, or wherever it's convenient, having people who are leaders in their community able to talk about these things, prepared to do so. And leaders can be organizations, it can be actual just specific people. But really what we want to do is give community members the tools to have these conversations themselves. So a lot of times our approach is, who are the stakeholders in this situation? So that may be the election administrators, that may be candidates themselves and making sure they're talking about things accurately and effectively. That is community leaders, that is, just whoever the mayor of the block is, you know what I mean? There's all sorts of different people, and making sure that those folks have access to that information, understand the value of it, and are able to share that with folks in language that is approachable, because oftentimes the language that we use around elections is very complex and technical, and that's because it has to be, right? Like these are laws and rules that make sure that this, scenario is playing out how it was intended to by the people who wrote those laws. And I have respect for that, but they are not written for the average person. And so one thing I always try to do is, my rule of thumb is typically if I had to learn a word in the course of learning about reforms, I try not to use it when I'm talking to voters, because it's not that I don't think they can handle that language. I think we need to give people credit for being smarter than we think sometimes. Voters are incredibly intelligent and are making really complex decisions in their day-to-day lives. They just aren't always in this language set. And so really making sure that we make participating in democracy as approachable as it should be, right? Like that is the goal. And so it's working with all these different folks, providing training, maybe a train the trainer model for organizations, providing them with basic resources of, whether that's a one-pager, whether that's a video, whatever it may be. Communities know their needs. And so our job is to listen, assess those needs, and provide them with the resources necessary and the structure so that they can be successful in educating their folks.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I appreciate so much about how Democracy Rising approaches the work, because it is so about meeting communities where they are. It's about essentially what you said just now. It's about democratizing democracy and socializing these reforms that there's something novel about them, but we know how to help people understand them. There's ways, again, to bring them into people's lived experiences. I think the other thing I've been thinking a lot about recently is how ranked choice voting as a reform fits overall into like a need for democratic revival in the U.S., whether that's something that happens in the next year or that's something that takes a longer time to occur. And the thing I'm curious to hear you reflect on is how, because both of us work a lot on the implementation side of things, right? Like once ranked choice voting has been adopted in a place, we're coming in and supporting that implementation. We may have spoken with campaigns, with advocates, with election administrators beforehand to help them understand what they'll need to do on the other side. But the bulk of our work is that implementation side. But I'm curious for you to talk a bit about, in thinking about democratic revival and thinking about how we make sure that people are socialized to these new things, that they're buying into new types of democracy. How does that handoff from the campaign, which is trying to sell this idea, is pitching it in a certain way, is packaging it in a certain way for voters? How does that handoff work from the campaign to the implementation stage? What are the things you're looking out for in an advocacy campaign that might make your job harder on the implementation education side? What are the things that might make it easier on the other side?
The biggest, not necessarily challenge, it really depends on the situation, is you are inheriting the friends and the opponents of the campaign as you meet them. But when I'm implementing and educating voters, I have no opponents. It doesn't exist, right? Because my goal is for every voter to understand this process, whether they love it or hate it, right? And so you may have had folks who are staunchly opposed for their own reasons. And my job is not to argue with those reasons. My job is to say, heard you. Unfortunately, this decision was already made. If it was
Right.
on the ballot, it passed by this much. If it was a legislative decision and saying, we are dealing in today and tomorrow, we are not dealing in yesterday. And that is a very easy pivot for me to make, right? Because I'm coming in knowing we have this much time to get this much done, and I have nothing to get over, right? And so I think the challenge really is throughout campaigns, you have to be persuasive and you have to say, the values, the benefits, what this will do. And the implementation is really the hard work of putting the effort in to create the circumstances where that's possible, right? There are so many variables in an election. Saying, with ranked choice voting, we'll have more competitive elections. Well, if there's an incredibly popular incumbent, they might just not have a ton of challengers, right? So I can't necessarily say that I'm going to manifest everything you've said, but my job is to make sure that the conditions are right for voters to understand how this works and for them to make that assessment afterwards, to put them in the best position possible to understand their ballot, for candidates to run understanding how ranked choice voting or other reforms change their approach to their campaign, really just provide everybody with the information they need to then make those educated decisions. And so, yeah, I think it's hard because we engage largely on implementation so we can be credible to everybody in this sense and not come in as the advocates. But the idea being, I wasn't in that sort of squabble. I wasn't in that discussion. And so I get to come in saying, I'll talk to anybody.
Right.
I'll have any conversation you want to have. I will hear your concerns and not feel the need to rebut them necessarily. And really just make sure that you can hate this all day. That's okay. As long as you know how to fill out your ballot, you can hate filling out your ballot the whole time, as long as you are making an educated choice while you do that, right?
Right.
So it's sometimes an easier position, sometimes a harder one, right? Because if there was really staunch opposition to a campaign, or if, a campaign's coalition formed in a certain direction because that's where the support was, of really filling out the rest of that as much as we can is the challenge. And so we've seen huge success in that because especially if this is something you oppose and you want to gain the political power to overturn it, you actually have to use the system to do that, right? Yeah. And so, it's definitely a challenge. And I often find that, campaigns are built around who raises their hand. And that's not always everyone in a community. And so, if there's a narrow win or something like that, really trying to build trust with communities after a campaign has been run and there is a presence, there is a record of sort of the community discussion around this campaign, that can get really tricky sometimes because that coalition, may have formed with super voters who are out there every election and really, into the wonky theory parts of this, whereas other folks are like, I heard the word, it's kind of a confusing word and all that. And so our job really is to then put it in lived experience, right? So one thing that I am always doing is giving examples of how, specifically with ranked choice voting, how that thought process exists in our day-to-day lives so that somebody who maybe didn't even vote on the referendum is able to think, okay, I may not have used ranked choice voting before and I may never have heard about it, but I've looked for an apartment and I've thought, okay, I really care about how close I am to public transit. I really care how close I am to a grocery store. And I really care about the schools. These are my three criteria. Where do these different apartments stack up on my criteria? Okay, this one's my first choice. If we don't get selected for this one, this is the second choice. That's a ranked choice decision, right? Yeah. And, most often we use food or beer or whatever we may use, but real hard decisions actually get made with this thought process. So really saying to people you are very capable of this thought process in ways that are even more complex than our politics, and really reassuring people of their own intelligence in their lived experience and then translating that to their elections. But the hardest part is getting to them and getting into those spaces.
The thing that came to mind for me, especially as you're talking about the harder decisions that people make when they're ranking and having preferences, having preferences is easy. Getting information that informs those preferences is hard. And I think the thing I keep seeing in especially because we work so much on local elections, is it can be very hard to find good, accurate information about candidates running in these local elections. And I'm curious, from your perspective, like, are there any places who are doing a great job of getting reliable, regular information about candidates in local races to people, whether it's a ranked choice voting or not? Because I think that is, for me, the thing that maybe people are saying when they're concerned about voters' ability to fill out an RCV ballot, but they can't put it to words.
Sure.
Because the ranking, again, if you have the right information, you can do it, but you need that information.
Totally. I mean, I think we can both agree that, like, I've never seen anything like the voters pamphlet that the voters in Portland, Oregon got. Like, whoa. But I mean, forever shout out to the League of Women Voters. I think most places that I've worked, there has been a guide that at least gives a rundown on the basics. I think what's hard is that there often is not a shortage of forums or, debates that you see with candidates at the local level. It's just access to those and knowing that they're happening. And that is equally a problem for the folks that maybe don't know about them as for the folks who desperately want everyone to know about the forum that they're hosting.
Yeah.
And so, it can be really tough. It can be difficult to find that information. And so that's part of why we do candidate training. Because as much motivation as I might have, my job is not to talk about platforms. My job is to make sure you know what that ballot looks like and you know how you're going to fill it out. Who really has the incentive are the candidates themselves. Right. And so we focus on making sure they understand the process so that if they are out there or on their website or wherever, they are aware of how ranked choice voting changes these things. And that, one thing we have seen, a piece of advice we always give is with ranked choice voting, particularly if you have a competitive election with more than 2 candidates, the issues do tend to come to the forefront more, which we are not super accustomed to other than in like bold, scary headlines on, the incessant political ads we're seeing these days. We don't necessarily see here's the problem in community and here's the solution I'm proposing. And so we're seeing, folks feel more comfortable asking for that. But having community organizations also be engaged, not just candidates, is really helpful for informing how they're endorsing and what information they're giving folks. So for me as a voter, I'm an expert on some issues and I am deeply not on others. And so my approach is always, who do I trust, right? This organization I trust on democracy issues. This organization I trust on housing issues. Mm-hmm. But I try to find who I trust in my community, and then I try to see what they're telling me about who's running, right? It saves me the work. And so that's also why we are educating endorsing organizations and trying to make sure news sources in particular are providing accurate information. That includes radio stations, even though they're not necessarily always reporting on news. It might just be fantastic songs on your drive home. But if they can let you know sort of what's going on in the dynamics and that there is ranked choice voting, that is one of our goals. So there's a lot of different ways, but I mean, I'll be just very frank. It is hard to get it's easier than ever and more difficult than ever to get that information, right?
There's so much more information. Finding the stuff that's like accurate and relevant is harder every day. Right?
And reforms aren't going to solve that, right? And so our job is to really try and give the most credible information we can and work with folks who are credible in doing that work in their communities to at least make sure that the information they're giving about the process is accurate, and hoping that they're doing that same due diligence around issues, candidates, all those other things. But we can't really cross that line, right? Since my job is only process.
Yeah, like both our responsibility organizationally, and I think there are just things that are clearly the responsibility of the candidates themselves, of these community organizations who are closer to the communities they represent and are actually a more trusted voice, right? Like, who is the right person to be saying this thing to this group of people? It's rarely going to be a national organization like one of us. Sometimes it will be. Most of the time it's going to be, like you're saying, who do you trust? Who do I trust as a person in a community? That's who is going to listen. The other thing I wanted to talk to you a bit about is the actual like voter, some more specifics about the educational campaigns that DR has worked on in the past. one big one you all worked on is Portland, Oregon's proportional RCV voter education rollout last year. And I just sort of wanted to give you the space to reflect for a few minutes on what you learned, because my memory is that mostly, like, we all had pretty much only worked on single winner RCV. There had been some proportional RCV before, but this was a huge PRCV specific work that had to get done. So what stood out to you? What are you taking away from that whole process?
Yeah, it was one, just always believe in voters is the top line. It's hard. It wasn't perfect, but it was pretty damn good. And so I think there was a lot of discussion of like, how did this go? And the answer is like, it went well. There are always ways we can improve. There are always things we can do better. But sort of an overview of what we were doing. My organization only works in partnership. We will never be the only person doing something. So we were working with Portland United for Change. Mm-hmm. The city put out a request for proposals on a program reaching Portlanders who had historically been left out of city hall decision-making. That is very broad reaching. Yeah. But it was basically saying, like, making sure that we are prioritizing those who have been left out, because there is often a trickle up of voter education, right? Where if we're reaching the folks who have been left out the longest, we will hit everybody who is participating regularly along the way within that, right? That's the theory. There was a communications aspect to this where we were reaching local radio stations, we were placing digital ads, doing all those sorts of things. But I'd say the bulk of my work was we had a mini grant program where we funded community-based organizations to conduct outreach to their constituency, whoever they viewed that to be. And so we gave grants to 11 community organizations who engaged in all different kinds of voter education activities. We provided them with a mock election platform so that they could run mock elections at all these events. And they did all kinds of things. A lot of it was folding education or voter education into existing work, not reinventing the wheel, knowing what you're good at. So for instance, there were some youth and elders councils that were meeting regularly and providing them with training so that they could go back and educate their community, right? There were night markets that one of our organizations hosted with like 1,500 people coming, and they just had booths for voter education. There was like 3 or 4 organizations that were present at Pride and were tabling with all these different things. We had folks hosting 5Ks and making sure that they were ranking their pump-up songs beforehand, right? So it was folding this in really brilliant ways. There were also organizations doing straight-up canvassing, like really hitting the doors and doing all of that. So we thought, let's take this broad approach with people who know the communities they're trying to reach, and let's fund them to include this in their work. And it was pretty incredible. We reached over 50,000 voters in the course of this. So and with the comms layered on top, it could look crazy, but I want to talk about the ones we touched and then had that conversation with. And so there's a few lessons learned. I had a really big moment of like, aha, when I was able to go to Ireland to observe their local elections, where they use the same system of, proportional ranked choice voting. And I got to witness people counting paper ballots in a public place with tons of observers. I got to talk to baristas, cab drivers, professors, reporters, all these different people about their system, and learning that like this feels big and scary when it's new. When it is ingrained, it is ingrained. And so it wasn't necessarily that the explanations were different. They actually used much more complex language than I was comfortable using. Yeah. But understanding when you make a culture shift in your elections, and these folks have been using the same system for almost 100 years. So the understanding that like the status quo is the status quo and people tend to understand it on some level. And that gave me a lot of hope of, there are 18-year-olds who understand the system. They're just used to it. And so our job was to get people comfortable because change is scary and that's hard. And they swung big with their changes to their elections. So that was in June. And that was like a big aha for me of like, not only can we do this, we are going to do this. Seeing how these community organizations took to this process and got excited and got creative also was huge. and seeing how fast we can pivot when we do these things. So, we were hearing, we didn't focus a ton on potential overvotes in our messaging. We really wanted to model, what to do rather than what not to do.
Mm-hmm.
But then we heard from folks in community that because, they were electing 3 folks, there was some confusion on if you should mark 3 people as your first choice. Of course, obviously. So then we pivoted and we changed our message to, hey, vote for 1 first choice, 1 second choice, 1 third choice. This is going to help elect 3 people. Your vote's going to do as much as possible, but you can only have 1, right? Simple, from community. In some ways we debated whether we should have done that from the beginning, and lesson learned, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's the other thing, is being humble in your approach of, 1, every concern is valid. Doesn't matter if it comes from a supporter and an opponent. It is something to be heard out. It is something to be considered, and assess whether you are addressing it and maybe someone hasn't seen that piece, so we need to amplify that, or if it's something you're just missing and you need to sort of revamp what you're doing. And just seeing so many stakeholders work together, right? Like, we all know coalition work is cumbersome and difficult, and that is the hard beauty of it. Right? But seeing the county just do a brilliant job with Multnomah County sort of quarterbacking on the election administration side, seeing the Portland transition team just creating things out of thin air that are brilliant and measured and thought through, seeing the Portland auditor's office like really starting to get their hands dirty with what this is going to look like moving forward, seeing community organizations, those that were in favor of the reforms saying, okay, we fought for this, so now we have to do the hard work of making sure it works. Seeing folks who were not bought in still saying, please provide us with the educational resources. Even if I don't like this, I need my folks to understand. And so just the sort of 360 effort. And this is the most disconnected I've ever been from the candidates, because, working with the city, it was just mostly I am focused on this solely, and I'm not talking to candidates at all. Yeah. And seeing even them really get it with their strategies and really embrace the process. For me, it was hard work. I don't ever want to act like this was just a walk in the park, but it was really valuable hard work. And it let me know that there is a way that you do this right. Mm-hmm. And I think many, if not all of the decisions that were made are how to do this right.
Right.
And I recognize not every city, county, state, whoever can invest like this. But my God, I wish they could, because I think it was really remarkable.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that is, to your last point about the city actually investing, they were ready to spend the money on voter education, because I think partly because it's a charter reform, the voters voted this in, they were required to fund it. And I do think there was, as a city, Portland wants to be a place that has this sort of perspective about community and is about engaging the community. And I think in this case, they did follow through. There's people at the national level always say are always criticize progressive cities for saying the right thing and not always doing the right thing. And I think this is an instance where Portland, in my opinion, followed through. They said they were going to do the right thing, and they did. The thing we can't rely on, like you're saying, is that cities won't always be interested in following through in this way if the reform came from even more from the outside of the halls of power, or if they just don't have the money, because we are probably about to enter a recession. And so localities aren't going to have the money to spend on voter education like this. And that's where you sort of have to start thinking more about what can we expect from, especially I think cities and counties with smaller budgets, what can they realistically be expected to do on voter education, and how can we rely upon foundations and donors to fill that gap in the short term? This is more of a question I'm pondering now. I don't know if there is the perfect answer, but it feels like something we're going to continue to confront in the coming years of what is the right balance. I think if it's a governmental reform, the government should pay to tell people about it, but that's not always going to happen. So how do we cover that gap?
I think an inside-outside strategy in any organizing endeavor is always the ideal, right? So I think those percentages of, who's paying for what may change, but the incentive shouldn't. I have found that this always works best when you have one thing I do want to say that I was thinking about as we were saying this is there's this assumptions made about bureaucracy and bureaucrats themselves that they cannot be innovative and creative. And that is just fundamentally untrue.
Yeah.
These are folks who are often doing a lot with a little. And so relying on some of that and encouraging some of that, but also forming partnerships where understanding, organizations that work in community and may have policy agendas are still really able to get a lot done and build trust in a different way than governments are.
Mm-hmm.
So I think really understanding what everybody's assets are that they're coming to the table with. Oftentimes, jurisdictions have the ability to do broad outreach, right? So that may be they send paper water bills to every household in the city. Well, you can slip a little voter information into that. And that hits every household in the city. That is one touch per household. That's brilliant. They sometimes have the ability to gain traction in media in different ways or have those relationships in different ways. You can present that message that way. What community-based organizations have the ability to do is engage and go deeper with that engagement. So, oftentimes cities can give you the what in ways that just no one else can, but organizations or, community leaders can give you the why, which is pairing those two is what our goal always is.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think as we move into whatever time we are moving into, I think a willingness to work together. And what can be tough there, as we talked about campaigns before, if maybe folks were like, this is going to be a lot for us to work on to change this at, whether it's the election administration level, wherever it may be, after that campaign is over, or hopefully during that campaign, having those conversations of like, okay, I get that this might not be ideal, right? Like I get that this might be hard to do, but how can we help?
Mm-hmm.
When it's the day after the election and fingers crossed we win, what does our day after that look like? What can we build to assist you in what you need to get done? And when those partnerships flourish, it's incredible.
Mm-hmm.
And I had the really huge benefit of my first foray into this in Minneapolis, seeing that work in ways that were brilliant, seeing the city be the leader on a lot of these things and sending a sample ballot to every single voter so they could see this before the election.
Right.
Having voter education ambassadors, but also the willingness to work with the folks at Fair Vote Minnesota so that we were not doubling up on every single event, so that we could say, hey, we actually have people doing class reps at the university here. So why don't you take this university over here in this other part of town? Right. So that ability to not duplicate work and to be cohesive in messaging.
Right.
That's the most important. Like if you're hearing it called something different, right? If the city of Portland had decided to call it single transferable vote rather than ranked choice voting, we would have confused voters just like I just confused myself by saying it.
Right.
Right. And so that cohesion and consistency in messaging is so good for voters to hear because they are hearing credible information from multiple sources phrased the same way, thus making it more credible. And so, wherever we're going now with however we're going to finance these things, I mean, just like bureaucrats can, I can do a lot with a little if I have people that are motivated to do these things.
Yeah.
I always want to fund people for doing hard work, right? So when I think of community organizations that before anything that is happening now, we're under-resourced and being asked to really be pillars in community, I always want to fund that work as much as I can. And so I hope that we can be creative and forward thinking and make sure that anytime we are asking folks to do that and expand an already probably expansive mission, that we're funding them to do that. But I also think the incentives for building power in community and community participation are there. So where we are aligned, I hope we can fund. But even so, as long as we're aligned, we can work together.
All right. Well, thanks again, Grace, for joining us today and walking us through what it takes to actually get people to buy into these reforms and embrace them as part of our democracy.
Thank you. You are a cherished friend and solid-ass colleague.
Thank you. Likewise. And now for this month's final round, where we share an interesting bit of trivia, a useful tidbit, or just something we thought was cool for folks to know about ranked choice voting. Here's Ryan Kirby with this month's final round.
Did you know that Greenbelt, Maryland is voting on an advisory measure on proportional RCV this fall? Greenbelt voters are being asked if they want to move their 7-seat city council elections from at-large winner-take-all elections to 7-seat proportional RCV. If voters approve PRCV, Greenbelt could become the 8th city in the U.S. currently using PRCV, and they'd be electing the second largest council with PR, after Cambridge's 9-seat city council. This proportional possibility makes it this month's final round.
Thank you for joining us today for our October 2025 RCV Clips episode produced by the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center. Make sure to subscribe to the show for the latest episodes and updates. Please take a minute to rate and review us on your favorite podcast platform too. For more information about RCVRC and Ranked Choice Voting, check out our website, www.rcvresources.org. The production of this podcast is supported by the generosity of our donors. Donations can be made directly on the website. Please don't hesitate to contact us with any questions at donate@rcvresources.org. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at RCV Resources and on Facebook and LinkedIn at Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at RCVRC. Our theme music is Flutterbee by Poddington Bear. Until next time, I'm Chris on behalf of the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center.